Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this wonderful Friday. And I am Dr. Adam Fayal, Director of Professional Learning and Leadership for All for Ed. And I am joined by two amazing individuals here. And we are here talking about 70 years of Brown versus Board of Education and the fight for educational equity. And I know this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I am so happy, as I mentioned earlier, to be joined by two amazing individuals. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves to you. Rebecca.
Thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Shackelford. I'm the Director of Federal Government Relations at Alfred. And as a way of introduction, I'm a former educator. I taught for several years. I also led a school before transitioning to working in civil rights and education equity. And obviously, I was a Black child in the United States, went through public education. And so these experiences are not just existential ones. There are also my lived experiences. And I'll pass it to Jen.
Hi, Jen Ellis, Director of State Government Relations at All for Ed. Not currently practicing, but lawyer, recovering lawyer, maybe. But yeah, here to offer some legal insight into the case from that perspective. Yeah.
And I feel you on that, Rebecca. I also grew up as a Black child in the South. Grew up in Alabama, so definitely this whole Brown v. Board of Education is something that's near and dear to my heart. And growing up, especially in the '80s, was something that wasn't too far removed from the time that I started my educational journey. So ladies, talking about Brown v. Board of Education, what is it for people who just hear it and don't understand what it is? Can you give us some context around Brown versus Board of Education?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on this one. So Brown v. Board of Education, it's a landmark Supreme Court case from 1954. I think a lot of people have heard the name. I think there are some things people know. There's a lot that people don't know about it because it just it's one of those things that's kind of come into the cultural lexicon, gets talked about a lot, but I don't think a lot of people actually dig into everything that happened. Ultimately, Brown v. Board of Education overruled a previous case called Plessy v. Ferguson. And Plessy v. Ferguson was not a case about education. It was actually a case about train cars. But as is true with a lot of Supreme Court cases, a case about one thing creates precedent for many, many things, right? So Plessy v. Ferguson ultimately resulted in a decision that said, as long as public amenities were equal, they could be separate. They could be segregated by race. So that's the doctrine of separate but equal. And that was the law of the land for a really long time. Brown v. the Board of Education took on the question of whether that doctrine, separate but equal, was constitutional in our schools. And it ultimately ruled it was not constitutional. What's interesting about Brown v. Board of Education, it's actually a unanimous decision, meaning all of the justices agreed in the final decision. This is not something we see very often anymore, very often historically. So makes it very notable for that reason. And I just want to read one sentence from the decision that I think is probably the part that most people know or have heard somewhere. This is from the end of the decision that would have been read out on the court on the day this was decided in 1954. So we come then to the question presented. Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race, even though the physical facilities and other tangible factors may be equal, deprive the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities? We believe that it does. And ultimately we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So this is the big moment, right? They're essentially saying, even if you can deem those facilities to be equal, the fact that they're separated by race makes them unequal. One interesting thing about Brown v. Board of Education, and this is a thing I think a lot of people don't know, it's actually not one case. A lot of times when a question comes to the Supreme Court, because these things take such a long time to work their way up, a lot of cases come at the same time with the same or similar question. So the court will grab them all and consolidate them into a big mega case. And that's what they did here. So Brown v. the Board of Education is actually 5 separate cases that got grouped together for purposes of the decision. And those 5 cases each have completely different facts, completely different plaintiffs, but they all led to this central question. And we could talk about that more in a little bit, but I think that's something a lot of people don't know. They're sometimes familiar with one of the cases or 2 of the cases, but there's actually like really interesting facts throughout that created policy and law. And a lot, like I said, a lot of this is stuff I had not known before looking into it really deep when I started, doing education policy. It's just something we don't talk about a lot about the case.
Okay, so you mentioned we were talking about the whole separate but equal situation, and here's something that I think gets lost in the whole concept of the schools, that the Black schools were inferior during this time period, because that was this notion that all these schools that the kids of color were going to were these dilapidated buildings, the teachers were horrible, no learning was happening. That wasn't the case. And I think that gets lost in this whole conversation as well, that these schools are these really horrible schools and nothing happened there. And with that being said, something happened also to the Black educator when we lost the Black schools through this whole process. Rebecca, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk specifically to the Black educators. So, we had a plethora of incredible Black educators pre-Brown. And after the decision, not the day after, but years later, when we look back, we can see that we lost over 38,000 Black educators in the South and the surrounding states. And then overall in the whole country, we lost 100,000 very highly qualified Black educators, teachers, etc., who were replaced by white educators that had far less education and far less qualified. And we really just, I believe, harmed our Black students with that experience, and our white students and our Latino students, everyone. There's such a benefit to having diverse classrooms, both in the rooms, which is something that Brown was working toward. But there's such a huge benefit to having a diverse educator workforce as well.
Yeah, on your point also, Adam, I said Brown is like 5 cases, not 1 case. The one that I think most people think of is actually not the named case. It's actually a case called Briggs. That case had the most prominent lawyers arguing it. It kind of took over the cultural narrative around Brown. In Briggs, that was a South Carolina case. The schools were very unequal, right? In that case, the segregated school that was for Black students, some of them didn't have heating, some of them didn't have restrooms, they didn't provide transportation to and from the schools, whereas all those things obviously were provided in the segregated schools available to white students. So that is kind of, I think, the image a lot of people have of Brown. However, I want to note, one of the other cases, the actual name case, Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which is the full name of that specific case, not the big mega case that became known as Brown v. the Board of Education. In that case, it was actually an elementary school student. She had an excellent school in her neighborhood, but it was segregated only for white students, and she was Black, so she could not attend. So she had to travel a far distance to go to the segregated school that was for Black students. However, in that case, the lower courts found those schools were equal in quality. It was an excellent school. So I think that's one of the things, a lot of people don't know that fact pattern, and that's a really important point. When they were creating the plaintiffs for this case, obviously they're finding situations where things are happening that are very inequitable, but there were a number of very good schools that were primarily for Black students. And so that's actually, I think, part of the case a lot of people don't know, because I think most people think of that Briggs fact pattern, right? Like the 2 really unequal schools. But even in this case, we have a situation where we have 2 schools that are actually deemed to be the same quality. It's just a question of distance. And so that's, I think, a really important thing to keep central here.
Yeah, and sometimes people forget that, or they think that all of these cases were focused on the South and like places where we traditionally think racism occurs. But the named plaintiff in the case is Ethel Brown, and she had a heart condition, and she had to travel 20 miles to go to the one school in her home state that allowed Black students, and that home state was in Delaware. So this is not just an issue in the South. This is a national problem, or is and was, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if this works the way I'm sure everything works in our legal system, as soon as the court case was done, it was fixed, right? So we didn't have to deal with racism, segregation. It was all done. Brown v. Board. Everything was fixed. Kumbaya. That's exactly what happened, right?
Yeah, totally. We're so good at it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's like important to remember when we think about the timeline. So, obviously here we are at the 70th anniversary. So this case was decided in 1954. Just for context, the Little Rock Nine, that doesn't happen until 1957. So just to like think about, and this is like, that's one example, right? But we will like these issues when they come to the court. I think a lot of people think that's like the period on the sentence, but in actuality, that's often the start of the work that needs to happen on the ground to actually get these laws enacted in a real way that impact real people, real students, real families, real educators. So, this decision in some ways, like it's a continuation of work that was happening, but it is like a beginning of a new chapter of that work. It was not the end. And, in some ways, the promise of Brown, like some would argue, has not been met still. Like the work absolutely continues. And so I think that's something people have to think about. Like it's great to note these important dates with these landmark cases, but we also have to remember like the work of enacting justice from these decisions is up to people, individuals, you and me, every single day. Without those people, without those actors in the system, our educators, our families, our students, our taxpayers, right? It's just a piece of paper.
Yeah, because you have many school districts that had desegregation orders put in place. And even until recently, some of them I know places in Alabama that had some things in place. I know my wife personally, in Georgia, she was a part of a minority to majority program where they had to bus students into these schools because we still find these schools being segregated based on where people live, based on their economic status. And you have schools that are now segregated because it's an economic situation where they're migrating, the white flight's happening from the cities. And so you're having schools that are segregated themselves, not by law, but they're being segregated based on where people live. And that also now becomes a funding issue. So going back to what we were saying earlier about schools not having what they need based on funding, we've tied funding to schools, development to school programs. And if the resources aren't there with the infrastructure, with the economy, what are we going to do to equalize things? What are we going to do to have that equitable access for all learners that we keep talking about? Because everyone says that. Everyone loves the kids. We all love the kids. We all want all kids to succeed until we have to actually do something about it. So my question, ladies, what are we seeing happening across the country as you are seeing these still segregated schools today? Because I think we're starting to see an increase of segregated schools, not due to law, but based on where people are living and based on economics.
Yeah, I mean, there's like such a push in the conversation and the rhetoric around this, and it's almost like, well, I mean, we all know this, like we blame poor folks for living in poor neighborhoods and then for having like schools that have no air conditioning, that have rats running around the buildings, that some of them don't have windows, things like that. Like these things like sound like they shouldn't happen in the United States, but they happen all over, right? And we then see things happen where we like, Adam, like you've talked about in your home state, where they're talking about rezoning schools to try to like create more of a separation. And like to like Jen, your earlier point, like there are still 200 school desegregation cases open right now on federal court dockets. Like this is not something that's over. And we argue about things in my world. I spend a lot of my time talking about money and trying to get our leaders on Capitol Hill to invest in education. And they're always not directly telling me, but I hear them telling others, like, we've already given so much. Like we gave so much in COVID relief, everyone should be fine. But we weren't fine to start. We had a big issue, like, a global pandemic. And now we're like further behind and we need even more support and more resources. And if we don't make these commitments and we don't make this investment in our future. Like that's our future doctors, that's our future leaders, that's like everything is like in the hands of our educators, and we like they deserve so much more than what we give them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, and Rebecca, I was going to say one thing and kind of take it to a micro level that we see happening in schools where there's even the segregation that happens within the classes, specifically like in the high schools, where the schools may be integrated, but you have a situation where your AP classes, when you walk into an AP classroom, it does not reflect what the population of the school looks like. That's where all your white kids are. Your kids of non-color are in some of these programs, your gifted, talented programs. But if you go look into your special education programs, that's where you start seeing your kids of color. So you may have the integration happening of schools, but then we have the segregation within the schools, within the systems that we have created within these programs. So those are those things that I think we miss sometimes with this whole with integration. Is bigger than just having the kids go through the same schools. We have to look at what systems we have within the schools that are segregating the students even further, and perpetuating this whole stereotype that we have happening in our schools. So you mentioned that, it had me thinking about in the micro level of what we're seeing within the buildings. Even though you have these desegregation acts in place and the integration happening in schools, you're still having segregation happening at the classroom level. I'm sorry, Jen. I mean, that was just, I know you're about to say something, but it just hit me. You know, that's something that personally hits me, because I know myself, I was often the one Black kid that was allowed to be in those classrooms. And I say allowed because that's kind of what it felt like, that because my parents had to fight and advocate for me to be in those classrooms at those times. So they're like, he has the grades, he has the capacity. Why isn't he in these classrooms or these courses? He should be in there. So a lot of times you have to have that advocate at the micro level to allow those students to be in those spaces. Sorry, I just feel very passionate about that part.
And that's true. Also, Adam, returning to something Rebecca had said a little earlier, like the question of like, in these cases, who is integrated? So like if the students are being integrated, but are the educators being integrated? Are the school leaders, are the district leaders? Like, are there efforts being made to create culturally responsive environments? Are there, you know, or are we just saying, we're opening doors to schools and saying, okay, we're going to like work on the student population? So I think sometimes that's something that's missing from the conversation is, you know, what actually is the promise of like truly integrated schools, right? What does that actually look like? Not just the student body, but like from leadership all the way down into the student body, right? And I think that that's something that is not in a lot of the conversations that I hear, frankly, when we talk about things like this. I hear a lot about the students, right? Families, decision, but we don't hear as much about what efforts are being made to actually like look at those systems as a whole, like every adult that's in that building, and ask those kind of questions.
Like, what can we do to normalize the conversation about equity? Because, you know, now, you know, equity is becoming a bad term in some districts. We had, you know, more recently in Virginia, for example, they decided to go back to Confederate names for schools that we changed. So are you going back to creating that environment where students feel welcomed? You know, what are we doing here? You know, you mentioned there's 200 open desegregation cases out there, over 200. So we're 70 years removed, but sometimes it feels like we're still fighting that same fight that was fought 70 years ago to get us going. So what can be done? What can we do as taxpayers, as citizens, as registered voters? What are things that we can do as individuals to help move this the direction that it needs to move in?
Yeah, I mean, I think personally, I believe the first thing we have to do is actually confront our history, right? You know, we are changing the names of those school buildings back to their Confederate names because we're not willing to have a conversation about what the Confederacy was and what it meant, right? Truly what it was, what it meant for you and me, Adam, and what they hoped for us. And once we do that, then we can start having these other conversations. But barring that, if we're not able to do that, I think we have to use the power that we have. We have to use our voices. We have to use our votes. And if you don't have a vote, if you're under the age of 18, if you're undocumented, there is still so much that you can do. You can speak out. You can teach others. You can just be an example, really, to folks on how to be this change. One of my favorite things is just spend some time scrolling on TikTok and watching how young people who can't vote in this next election are talking about what they need from us. And then I take that on as my responsibility. I need to vote for them because this is their future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Adam, you're saying, these we talked about this case 70 years ago, but the issues are reverberating in the conversations now. One of the things I was really struck by when I was really digging into the fact patterns of the cases that become Brown v. the Board of Education, particularly the Briggs case, South Carolina case, where the schools are very unequal around the question of providing transportation to school. So providing school buses, right? Where they were not providing school buses for many of the primarily Black schools. They are providing school buses for the white schools. One of the big arguments in the state was taxpayers were saying, well, that's fair because we're just basing it on the income of the tax base. So this school can afford the buses because their tax base is higher income. This school can't. We are still having a variation of this conversation in a number of ways in a lot of our cases about who pays for what, who has to pay for someone to get this or someone to get that. And I think, unfortunately, it's the wrong lens on the conversation as a whole. And it continues to be the wrong lens on the conversation 70 years later. This is any education debate, we talked about bonds or people put it anywhere in the country you can go and you're going to find a variation of this conversation about something in the education system. They might look a little different, but something in their education system. And I think one of the things that we can think about today, when we think about our education system, it is a system, and a system is a bunch of little parts working together, right? We are the little parts. So if we want a robust system, we have to put into that system. We have to foster that system. We have to grow that system, and we have to have faith in it. So one of the things that I think is really important, people think about this being decided in a courtroom with a bunch of lawyers, or this being decided by policymakers at your state capitol. The promise of Brown happens with all of us, right? Putting our energy, our effort, our passion into our schools, being willing to ask these hard questions and have, difficult conversations. That's how the promise gets realized day to day. In our classrooms across America, as we're on this, podcast right now, there are educators across our country in classrooms with students that they are the promise of Brown, the Board of Education, right? So they have to be at the table for the conversations we're having. And so I think we forget that sometimes is every taxpayer, whether you have kids in the education system or not, when you go to the ballot and you vote on education, when you vote for people who have positions on education, you are moving this forward or not moving it forward. That we are the education system. And so I think people sometimes minimize their role, what they can do. It doesn't have to be a big thing. You don't have to run for president to change the education system. You can show up on election day and vote for the bond your school needs to have the resources they need for their students. That you've made a huge difference by doing that. So I think people sometimes minimize their role in this. And they have to remember, this is how the justice of these decisions gets done. It's day to day, it's minute by minute, and it's us. That's it. It's us. It's not anybody else. And so I think that's something really important. I will also say, in addition to my work, being a new mom, I think we have to remember as parents, it's, hard sometimes because you have your children and you think this is the most important baby that's ever been born. No one can even imagine. And we do want to protect our children, right? We do want the best for our children. That's natural instinct. It's a beautiful thing. But we also have to remember, I think it serves all of our children when we have a robust system that serves all children. And so we have to
Mhm.
be willing to, as we look at what's best for our own children, also look at what's best for everyone's children. And we have to be willing to have those conversations. And we have to be willing to like think about the world in that way. And that's something we can all do, just like in your home, in yourself, right? Like some of this work just happens inside of ourselves. Um,
Mhm.
and challenging your own beliefs, your own systems, your own anxieties or fears, and like being willing to have those thoughts and push forward, and ask those questions and do that research. So I think that's something that's really, really important in this conversation. Because we are in a time when politically there's a lot of conversation about whether people trust the school system, whether they're investing in the school system. And like, that's us as individuals having those conversations, making those choices. Yeah.
Yeah, because I see a lot of stuff happening around the voucher movement, the
Mm.
privatization of schools, where it's almost this resegregation that's happening.
Yeah.
It's to the point where no one wants to say the quiet part out loud when you start talking about schools and being able to determine what schools are based on race. 'Cause I think everyone can look at their local area, and there's probably schools that you say are, oh, this is the black school. This is, oh, well, we have a lot of Latinos at this school. We have a lot of white kids at this school. Just based on your map or your region, these
Yeah.
are things that people know, but nobody will say that or do anything to help correct those inequities that happen at those schools. Because very often at those same schools that are said, the white schools have more resources very often. I remember vividly going to some of those schools and seeing their athletic facilities and being in awe, looking like junior colleges in some cases, when we were running on track on asphalt and broken tiles and,
Mhm.
and glass and things of that nature. But seeing other schools and just looking at, oh my gosh, they have so much stuff. How is this even possible? How is this the same school system where you have this school that has this over here and this other school that doesn't have this resources over here over there? And I know here in Georgia, especially in the metro area, most of our schools are county schools. But then you have places where they're trying to get city schools. But basically, to your point, we don't want our money to go to those other kids in that other area. We don't want our money to go to the kids on the south side of town. Always the south side. We don't want the kids in the south side to have the resources that we have here on the east side or the north side. And so they try to now separate and become their own school district, or go to the private schools or go to their own charter system and leave the public education system to kind of keep their resources there. So I'm so glad you brought that point. Jen, we have to stay a part of the system to help fix the system. You can't leave the system and expect it to fix itself, because it's not going to happen. We've been here 70 years and we're still trying to get this thing fixed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I think about it in my head, because I tend to be very visual. It's like we want to have this beautiful garden. We all want to look out and see this beautiful garden, but at the same time, we all want to take our flower and go home and like grow it in the pot that we know will like, we want to be like, we're going to get the best pot and the best soil. And we want to like put it in our little window and keep it safe. And the reality is like, if everybody takes their little flower home, there's no garden, right? And you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
have a kid in the system to have a flower in the garden. I'm talking about
Mhm.
your volunteer time. I'm talking about your vote. I'm talking about your advocacy. You know, we're in neighborhood conversations where you hear things come up. Like, are you willing to say something? Are you willing to push a conversation? Or those don't have to be hostile conversations. I'm talking about just social conversations. But I think that's the way I think about it, is like, you know, sometimes parents have to make choices where they're in situations with their kids, and they're the only ones in those situations seeing the details, right? But I always try to keep central, like, am I keeping my flower in the garden so everyone can enjoy the beautiful garden? And I think that's something I try to think of, not just in education, but I think particularly in this moment in education is really, really critical for parents to be thinking about. This is not really a decision young students can make, right? They don't have all the context to understand what's happening all the time, though our high school students definitely do, and they should be at the table in this. Sometimes they have some of the most important voices, and the voices that challenge us the most, which is really critical. But I think that's something particularly for parents and taxpayers and community members to be thinking. You know, it's not fair to show up to the public schools and say like, well, these aren't good when you haven't funded them and you have like stopped every effort they've made to improve and you've pulled your kids out and I mean, like, yeah, like when we don't put into the system is going to fall apart. We are the system. So I think that's something I try to keep very central. I think is on this anniversary of Brown v. the Board of Education and every day important for us to really sit with and think about and remember, especially with an election coming up down the road. Yeah.
So Rebecca,
Mm-hmm.
this is one thing that also I hear a lot about integration with schools, that it wasn't necessarily the best thing for students of color, in the fact that students of color lost their own identity in the case of integration of schools. And this is going to the thing we talked about earlier with the loss of the Black educator. So what can we do to really increase, one, the sense of worth that these students have in school, but then also increase the number of educators of color that are out there, because it is an underrepresented field in these schools, whether we're talking about it even within the African American community, having educators of color, or just in schools in general. So what are things that you see as things that we can do to kind of bridge this gap that exists?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I'm thinking about this a lot. So as you know, I'm Afro-Latina. So I think about I know we all do, but like very personally, think about the needs of Black children and also the needs of Latinos students, like my cousins, and like some of whom are undocumented. And I think, I was trying to think about when the first time I saw a Black teacher in a classroom, and it wasn't until 5th grade. And I don't even know that I connected that Black folks could be teachers. And that's when I decided I wanted to be a teacher, right? I knew my dad wanted to be a teacher. And so I knew that it was obviously possible, but there were so many circumstances that stopped him from being able to be one, that I was like, I don't know if it's ever going to be possible for me. And then in 5th grade, I was like, oh, it is. The Black folks in this building aren't just the janitors and the people who work in the cafeteria, right? So I think we just have to do more. And I think it's really powerful that today about 15,000 of our educators are DACA recipients. So young people get to see themselves there. And we just need to do more work of diversifying our teacher workforce. We need to make teaching, as you know, a profession that is valued, that is respected, that is well paid. I never thought that I would leave the classroom. And I sometimes feel a little bit guilty for doing it, because I recognize that there's that means that there's one less person in that school building that looks like me, right? And so I try to use my voice and my time and my work to try to increase the number of folks like that. But I did feel like I was pushed out of that space. It didn't always feel safe for me to be there. So we have to make sure that it's also safe for the educators to be in those spaces, to be able to say what you just did to that little Black girl, and when you were talking about her hair was not okay, how you were talking about some border issue in front of your students, when you thought they weren't listening, was not okay. Those things are really risky for educators to do, and we have to make sure that our the school culture is different and changed. And I don't know, Adam, if you've had experiences like that. I know you grew up in the South, you also had the experience of being an educator in the South as well.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where being a Black man in school, I've had so many situations where I was working with the students and with the parents, where when they saw me, I could tell that they made eye contact with me, and it was that connection that was there. They was like, okay, there's someone who looks like me here, so let me talk to this person. Maybe they can understand what I'm saying. I'm this other person. They're not understanding me right now, or there's this innate connection that we have there. So those are some of those things that I think sometimes just having those faces that look like you can get that connection at times that that you can't just describe. It just happens. It's that natural feeling. It's almost that familiar feeling when you see these individuals in those spaces. And when you talked about, I'm glad you mentioned being Afro-Latina, because this is the other aspect that we talk about with Brown v. Board. We're more diverse as a country in 2024 than we were 70 years ago. So how has this Brown v. Board also impacted the diversity of our country as we stand today? Because we have more color in this country than we've ever had before. But the color is not necessarily reflected in the classroom. Where we have, I think I was looking at a CNN report where I think it was from the 2020 census, it was 80% of our teachers are white. But we know that's not the same makeup of our country. So how do we diversify? How do we meet the needs of our diverse population where our classrooms, the educators, the leaders, the decision makers don't necessarily reflect who's in our buildings? I know we're getting deep on this one. We're getting deep on this one.
I mean, I think we have to keep talking, right? Like, I think
right.
Too often, like we keep saying 70 years, and it is intentional. Like, it is, because it's a reminder that there are people in Congress right now. There are people in our White House right now who went to school before the Brown decision was made, who went to segregated schools. Like, this was not that long ago, and the same issues are playing out for the same population of students, but also for other populations of students, right? Like, we see the coming tide against undocumented students with the same arguments that we had in the past that Jen mentioned. Like, we like talk about it being around funding, but Plyler v. Doe is another case where we, as a nation, made a commitment to undocumented students, saying that they deserve a free public education, and they do. Every child in this country, I don't care where you were born, like anything, it doesn't matter. You deserve the best of us, and we have to keep fighting for that.
Yeah, and we know that there are organizations publicly, this is not secret information, that are discussing that they would like Plyler v. Doe to be overturned. And for those who don't know, Plyler v. Doe was a case that this is a case out of Texas, where the Supreme Court said school districts have to educate everyone. Students who are coming from homes with undocumented parents, they have every right to be educated, like any other student that shows up in the school. That is the law of the land as it stands right now. Were that case to be challenged or overturned, that would be a substantial change to how we view our education system. There could be other challenges to other types of education rights down the road. Like I said, these things are always kind of interconnected, right? And like we talked about before, a lot of the conversation around Plyler v. Doe comes down to money, right? Who's paying for who thinks they should or should not have to pay for who. And, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, but absolutely, I think Plyler v. Doe is openly being discussed as a case that might need to be reheard in some circles. And so this is something that, like, people need to know about. This is a conversation happening now. This is a case that could be overturned. I'm not even talking about in our lifetimes. I'm talking about in the next 4 to 5 years, if we're not on top of it and not doing this work in a real way. So I think that's really important. I think one of the other things, coming to the 70th anniversary, there's a lot of different websites and legal groups that are doing like remembrances. There's a lot of historic photos and stuff like that, which are always very interesting to see. But one of the things that really strikes me about them, also when I look at pictures of like the Little Rock Nine, when I look at pictures of Ruby Bridges, I'm so excited by the passion of our young people right now around a lot of matters of justice. But it also makes me sad that too many of these cases fall on the shoulders of our children. Like, if you look at these pictures, these are kids that we're talking about. And all 5 of these Supreme Court cases that become Brown, these are children. Some of them as young as 7, some of them are high school students. The Little Rock Nine are high school students, right? Walking with the National Guard through like a throng of screaming adults. Ruby Bridges is a child, right? In those pictures. I mean, like, you've seen the pictures, how tiny she looks, like walking in, and adults, like grown adults. So I think one of the things also that I think about is just, when we think about Plyler, we're talking about these children's education, these children's future. And too often these civil rights education fights are falling on the shoulders of our children to have to do really difficult or impossible things while they wait for the adults to get it together. So like, I'd love for our generation of adults to be the ones who got it together. So just something that I think about when I look at these photographs, how young these people are, in circumstances that, I mean, just I would have shuddered to face,
yeah.
And we put them on the front lines of these fights again and again and again. It's really, really unfair. And so I think that's something that I'm thinking of on this anniversary as I see these pictures. I invite everyone to go find some and just really look at the reality of how young these kids are.
Yeah, I think we were chatting earlier about this, and it was earth-shattering to my daughter, who's 13, when we were talking about Ruby Bridges, and I mentioned, Ruby Bridges is the same age as your grandmother. And I said they could have been friends. They're the same age, and because she saw this black and white picture of this girl, and in her mind that was so long ago. Because kids, everything is to them. I'm old anyway. They're like, Dad, back in the olden days. So for her, but that was kind of like this like light bulb went off. Like, oh my gosh, this wasn't some ancient time. So long ago. And you mentioned on the back for our kids, I mean, whether you're talking about guns in school and the violence that our kids deal with, or some of the gender biases that some of our students are having to deal with today, whether or not they can go to the bathroom of their choosing, all these things are happening to our kids. And I think that's where we really need to realize it's about the children. So let me ask each of you this from the All for Ed perspective. So from the state and from the federal level, what are some things that All for Ed is really has their hands in or being a part of to really fight for this educational equity that we're talking about today?
I can go first. First, I'd like to just share something that All for Ed as an organization does that I think is incredibly powerful. So every member of the All for Ed team has the flexibility to use one of their work days every month to support a K-12 school in the K-12 system. To Jen's point earlier, of all of us being part of the system, we truly believe that, and we try to live that by making that part of our workplace culture, part of our human resources systems. And I just believe that it's incredibly powerful and makes me really proud to work for such an organization that says what they mean and means what they say and lives by those things, right? And then on the federal side, we have incredible research and resources. Last year, we came out with a series of papers on Title I, which is the largest funding source, federal funding source for education. We do lots of work on resource equity. And when we talk about resource equity, we're not just talking about money, although money really matters. We're also talking about the other kinds of resources, safe buildings, incredible teachers, and all of the tools and curricula that young people need as well.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on the state side. So last year we released our State Policy Center, which is a big hub on our website where we have collected all of our various state policy proposals. We have model legislation, we have case studies. This is really a hub for not just lawmakers, but advocates and even, people who are just listening, who are like, I'm just an interested, taxpayer. Fantastic. These are resources you can take and talk to your elected officials as well. All of these are geared at educational equity, looking at things like making sure all students have access to really robust college and career pathways. A big push on there is around data transparency. We can't know if a program or a system is working equitably if we can't see the data in a way that we understand and we can get access to. That's something that we're pushing for in all 50 states. The other thing is doing work around digital equity and what that truly means, not just making sure everyone has devices or broadband, though that is very important, but also looking at things like, does every student have access to an educator who has received training in digital literacy where they can fully integrate that into their classroom learning, whether in their educator training or through their own professional learning? And, looking at how all these things come together to create that equity actually in the classroom. So, I'd welcome anyone to explore that website, explore the resources. We have an email there if people are interested in partnering with us or have questions. We're always happy to get questions, comments, suggestions for future work. So don't hesitate to write us. It's on the end of the email. It's just me. So it's me, but feel free to send an email. I will answer you. So yeah.
Yeah, and on the Future Ready side, we do a lot of work working with our schools. I really believing that every child, regardless of their zip code, deserves an opportunity to have access to resources. And really, we want school districts to really build whether it's their portrait of a graduate, portrait of an innovator, their Future Ready plan, whatever you want to call it. We would love for you to use our Future Ready gears and framework around building that. But it's really about providing equitable access to every student, regardless of where they live, regardless of who their parents, whether they're documented, undocumented, whatever. We want to ensure that students have the resources that they need. So with that being said, it's time, I want to take it to our parting shots, if you will. So, Rebecca, Jen, as we look at, we're talking about 70 years and our aspirations for the future, as it pertains to ensuring equity for our students, what would you like to see moving forward? We have this court case, we have the tools. What would you like to see moving forward?
I hope that maybe not the next, but it would be amazing if it was the next 10-year mark. That we're not here, that we don't need to be here. We don't need to be having this conversation because we've worked really hard to address these issues so that they are no longer things that we need to discuss, and that instead we're spending that day just celebrating the young people who did this incredible work for you and for me. And it's a celebration and not a reminder. While this today, of course, is a celebration, but it's not it can just be that, as opposed to one where we're also challenging ourselves to do better.
Yeah, I second that completely. I think honestly, the only thing I would add is I'd love to see, if I think that 10-year out, I would love to see just the tone of the conversations be different, where we're talking about all of our children succeeding in these conversations. And there's less, I think, fear and people being worried about, if I have to put in money for this education system, then how will I have money for my children? Or how will I have I'd love us to be able to almost collectively in this conversation, take a deep breath, ask some hard questions, have some hard conversations. But I'd love for us to have at the center a concept that all of our children are all of our children. We succeed as a country when all of our children succeed. I always say, vote like your future heart surgeon is in a public high school right now, because they probably are. And I'd love to see us, be joyful in this work when we think about what we can do for all of our children, instead of scared about what it means, for our individual bubbles, right? So I think, if we were there in 10 years, my ideal dream, I think that would really be a landmark to remember. It'd be a cause to really rejoice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna steal what you said earlier, Jen. And I just envision this. We just had Mother's Day, and my kids did this for my wife. Every year they plant a seasonal garden for her, and the beauty of planting a seasonal garden is the kids picking out all these beautiful flowers. And I just love how they just say, "Oh, I like this color. I like this color. I like this one. This one." There's no rhyme or there's no reason to it. I spent way too much money buying a lot of different flowers, but it looks so beautiful with all the colors of the garden, all these wonderful plants, all with lilies, daffodils, so on. I think that's what I want to see. The beauty of, as you said earlier, everyone leaving their plants, bringing their plants to us, having them grow, having them flourish, and seeing the beauty of the diversity. I think that's where our strength and power lies as a country, is the beauty of our diversity, being able to be stronger together. And I think that's where I want to see us. And my moving forward, 10 years out, being able to look at that garden and see how beautiful it is based on all those wonderful faces of all these kids from diverse backgrounds from all over our country. That's what I want to see. That's what I want to see. So thank you for inspiring that thought in my head, Jen. I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to take
No
that.
problem.
Well, I want to thank everyone for viewing this episode today around 70 years of Brown v. Board of Education and the fight for educational equity. And I want to remind each and every one of you that the power is in your hands. We're just sitting here talking about it, but each and everyone listening here, take action, be a part of it. And what is going to be your 10-year viewpoint of Brown v. Board? What is it going to look like in the country? Is it going to be a celebration? As we talk about Independence Day, where we're celebrating, shooting off fireworks. You know, what is it going to be in 10 years when we look at where our country has gone and the strength of our diversity? So thank you, everybody, for chiming in and viewing our episode today. Thank you.